So, thank you very much. It is a privilege for me to deliver a lecture today here. Dear friends, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I will say a few words on institutional dynamics of the EU after Maastricht. I'll try to put it in the light of separation of powers doctrine. Now, I start with a reminder on Jonathan Swift's famous work, Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726. There is an inspiring and ironic part of the text that the writer called Modest Proposals, offering a series of solutions to many burning questions of Lilliputania. Reading that particular book chapter, one can see how much the imagination of classical literature can serve us as a reminder of how new political and legal entities, with their attitude towards classical institutions and traditional vocabulary of constitutional engineering, almost regularly create, change, and dissolve taboo topics from the seemingly consolidated glossary of the already known legal and political world, as well as of the emerging one. Hasn't something similar happened with the emergence and development of political and legal institutions in Europe after the Second World War? Especially as it concerned those institutions that fall within the framework of Europe's ambitious and far-reaching constitutional project of building peace, economic prosperity, and the rule of law. Now, marking the 30th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty is a favorable opportunity to recapitulate that event, which on one side impressed with a series of innovations, but on the other side also produced doubts, disbelief, unknowns that emerged in the process of its implementation, which the European public faced after its entering into force in 1993. Now, it is enough to briefly remind that in the period of 30 years since the signing and entering into force of the Maastricht Treaty, the union created by it has grown in size, scope, and capacities. Today's EU is quite a respectable actor on the global stage. It is the world's largest trading bloc. It's the center of issuance of the second strongest currency in the world. Now, a key step towards this extraordinary development, however, was made during 1991, when representatives of only 12 member states gathered in Maastricht to finalize a new alliance treaty. I'm coming from the Republic of Croatia, the last, then 28th, not anymore, country to accede the EU. Croatia became EU's member state in 2013, meaning that this year we mark the 10th anniversary of the accession. Now, from 1st January to 30 June 2020, Croatia took over the presidency of the Council of the EU for the first time, of course. As noted then by the Prime Minister Plenković in a foreword of the official program, the Croatian presidency came at a time of great changes for the EU, at the beginning of a new institutional and legislative cycle following the new composition of European institutions. And that new, comprehensive framework, let me add, in many aspects started exactly with the Maastricht Treaty. Now, Maastricht, according to some, was a key moment in European integration because it represented the crown of economic integration, creation of single currency. However, researching the processes on a broad scale and within the longer time cycles, one can notice how the changes that have shaped the EU over the last 30 years have also stimulated major shifts on constitutional and institutional level. Now, there is one simple fact. The European Union cannot be understood without a closer knowledge of its institutions. However, researchers differ on the question of what exactly are institutions, how do they function, why are they important? Now, the simplest definition of an EU institution refers to it as the decision-making body. Such determination, of course, is also connected with the concept of EU institutional policy as a sphere where formal but also informal rules, norms, procedures, practices shape that decision-making. Now, in order to clarify the question of institutional reforms and institutional dynamics of the EU after Maastricht, I will try to reflect upon the issue of separation of powers in the EU. So this segment is interesting for at least two reasons, I would say. First of all, it is so because the issue and significance of the separation of powers, nolens volens, has been an inseparable part of the theory and practice of democratic constitutionalism since the 18th century. This means that even Maastricht, which enabled the upgrading of new constitutional architecture for the Union, could not simply ignore the principle of responsible exercise of the political power and will of EU institutions. Namely, it is so because main goal of these principles ever since Montesquieu is nothing but the realization, preservation, and strengthening of the lawful government, in other words, government of law. Meaning, in the same time, it is not the maintenance and defense of mere gubernaculum, as the will and caprice of the power holder. Therefore, separation of power doctrines, which plays a key role in the creation of any political government within the nation state, I guess we can say that, yes? Yeah. Mutatis mutandis seeks its place across national borders as well. There is a difference, however, between the classical division of powers, of course, and the substitution advocated by the Court of Justice of the European Union in the established structure and dynamics of the EU institution developed after Maastricht. By constitutionalizing the institutional structure of the EU, Maastricht Treaty certainly shed new light on the question of existence, adaptations, design, new understanding and contact of separation of powers as an old principle of constitutionalism, now in new circumstances. And indeed, in a historical sense, the Maastricht Treaty represented one of the most important evolutionary additions to the European integration treaties. It contained provisions for the creation of economic and monetary union, including single currency. It tried to increase the democratic legitimacy by strengthening the European Parliament. We heard about that already. I won't repeat that. It further developed existing policies. It also added some new ones. Now, the idea that could have been sensed maybe above all these measures testified in fact that to the creation of a far-reaching economic and political union, maybe that could one day become the United States of Europe. So, although the idea was initiated on a wave of great optimism about the EU, one must not forget the context of real political circumstances that then still existed in Europe. Namely, the European continent was still divided into rival political and legal systems. That is why it is no wonder that the treaty itself was not a completely coherent or symmetrical agreement. It was obvious that of all amending treaties, exactly this one was created in the most difficult setting. And that is why it has often rightly been pointed out that the Treaty on the European Union was the last treaty of the Cold War. So, what is the importance of institutions? Inside any attempt to understand the phenomenon of European integration and EU itself lies the vital need for a thorough knowledge of the institutions in their respective contexts. Institutions are, of course, important for different reasons. First of all, they enable the architecture of every political system, including the EU. The obligation, responsibility of achieving efficient, democratic, and transparent political system always rests on these institutions. Now, according to some, Philip Dam, for example, the analysis of EU institutions actually represents the analysis of a moving object. Central parts of what is today the very core of the institutional system did not even exist at the beginning of the European project. We can take example of European Council, which is not even mentioned, of course, in founding treaties. We could take an example of European Parliament that experienced really dramatic change regarding its role. So, the European Union is undoubtedly one of the most complex international communities in institutional sense. The Maastricht experience showed that construction of Europe requires the construction of, at least partly, new institutions. So that treaty opened the process of building a new political Europe. For some, it enabled a shift from functionalism to constitutionalism and the strengthening of central institutions. According to others, it meant crossing the Rubicon to federal Europe. For Joseph Weiler, for example, the almost submerged Maastricht was the most important constitutional moment in the history of the European construct. Of course, it doesn't mean that the constitutionality of Maastricht Treaty itself wasn't questioned. Just before 1st November 1993, when treaty entered into force, the German Federal Constitutional Court issued its famous judgment. So, Constitutional Court's decision confirmed basically the constitutionality of the treaty and thereby opened the way for German further participation in future European integration process. It is well known, however, that Court's decision contains still certain positions in obiter dicta that then caused quite a stir in the European Union. Now, maybe the most famous is about the limits of the power of European law that will be decided by national, not transnational court, in this case, German constitutional, and not the Court of Justice of the European Union. So, it concerns legal acts of the Union that go beyond the competences specified in the treaty. But, on the other hand, Constitutional Court did not elaborate on the likely practical effects of the decision. So, in spite of everything, although it apparently took bold steps, it did not actually call into question European Union, of course. Instead, the Constitutional Court opened the door and provided sort of guidance for continued European integration. Now, the successive reforms agreed in Amsterdam, then in Nice, mainly did not change the Maastricht organizational structure. Finally, the Lisbon Treaty was adopted, and it retaining the most important aspects of the ill-fated constitutional treaty. With Lisbon Treaty, existing EU institutions have had their powers increased, while both the European Council and European Central Bank have formally been given the legal status of an EU institution. The existing powers have been reorganized to some extent. The President of the European Council became a stable and full-time function. The institution of High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy was introduced, etc., etc. In fact, one might rightfully conclude that the Lisbon Treaty was largely, if not mainly, about institutional changes. Now, as it regards separation of powers in the constitutional arrangement of the European Union, one could ask the following question. Is the new post-Maastricht EU structure familiar with the old doctrine of the separation of powers? There are authors who explicitly claimed that the Union does not align to any rigid doctrine on separation of powers. The ultimate meaning of the classical doctrine, ever since Montesquieu, Madison, and others, was in the division of state power in its totality. That is because when the power is divided between autonomous bodies, then each of them acts as a controller of the other. So freedom itself will survive precisely thanks to the existence of that control. Finally, the value of separation of powers lies in emphasizing the checks and balances that are necessary to prevent abuse of the ever-growing powers of the executive. However, unlike the nation-state, in whose organization of power this separation of powers is a central principle, in international or supranational organizations, it has never been applied, let's say, in a strict or literal sense. Many will point out that the structure of the EU has never been based so much on division of powers as it has been on notions of institutional balance. There are, of course, different deviations from the classical concept of separation of powers in European treaties, and instead of classical principle formulated by Montesquieu several centuries ago, at the EU level, the concept of institutional balancing is accepted and pronounced. It was the Court of Justice who articulated the principle of institutional balance for the first time in Meroni case. The principle got later its clearest expression in the context of the so-called comitology, that is, set of procedures according to which committees consisted of member states' representative constitutes the framework within which the Commission exercises its implementing and delegated executive powers. Of course, later the Court of Justice dealt with the institutional balance in Chernobyl case as well as in other cases. The court, we all know, I'll just remind, concluded that the treaty set up a system for distributing powers among the different community institutions, assigning to each institution its own role in the institutional structure. Nevertheless, there were significant fluctuations in the court's jurisprudence, even to the extent that there is not even a unanimous opinion that institutional balance is a fully general principle of EU law. Concluding that Montesquieu never went to Brussels, Professor of Constitutional Law Giuliano Amato was among the first to express skepticism towards the incorporation of the principle of separation of powers into the new treaty structure. And yet, no matter how evident it is that in Article 6 of the Maastricht Treaty, which states the fundamental principles of the EU, the separation of powers principle isn't mentioned expressis verbis, there is a broad consensus that the principles of liberty, democracy, respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and of the rule of law implicitly include the separation of powers. In other words, EU's fundamental values should follow the classical principles. I will try to conclude. Short remarks. The nature of the relationship between constitutionalism and international organizations persistently emphasizes the fact that the basic postulates of national constitutionalism are also to be respected as part of the law of international organizations. European institutions had to be and have to be open to changes necessary for their better and more efficient functioning, and they had to be open for that since the beginning. Now, with the purpose of creating a more perfect institutional structure, bearing in mind the level of complexity of the EU, as well as number of intra and inter-relations, this process is undoubtedly far from over. That goes together with the conclusions we have heard today, I would say. So this is the framework in which constant search for the principle of separation of powers in the European Union should be understood. Despite the dominant view that the EU, its institutional structure and distribution of powers do not precisely reflect traditional trias politica, the classical principle still provides the most convincing answers to the problem of avoiding the concentration of power. So, mutual checks and balances on all levels. Otherwise, I'm afraid we might experience even more gubernaculum in years to come. Thank you.